Hi, I think we're going to get started. We normally start at 6 o'clock, but we'll start a few minutes early because the food's already in here, so it's easier just to get going, and so we'll get started. Hi, my name is Jeff Montes de Oca. I'm the director of the Center for the Critical Study of Sport. Tonight's talk is a part of the Ethics in Sport speaker series that explores ethical issues and their implications in the world of sport. This series of talks is organized by the Center for the Critical Study of Sport and is sponsored by the Daniels Fund Ethic Initiative at UCCS. Before we get started, before I introduce our speaker tonight, I just want to mention that we do have a couple of talks coming up. One will be with John Hoberman from the University of Texas. He's one of the world's leading scholars of doping and performance enhancement. His talk is titled "The End of Sport: Why the Doping Epidemic Must Be Brought Under Control." So John Hoberman's been active in the field of sports studies for 40 years within the field of doping and human enhancement. He has the following books: Mortal Engines, The Science of Performance and the Dehumanization of Sport; Testosterone Dreams, Rejuvenation, Aphrodisia, Doping; and Dopers in Uniform, The Hidden World of Police on Steroids, that'll be coming out later this year. I think you'll find him a fascinating speaker, and it should be a really interesting talk, so I encourage you to go ahead and register and join us. When is that? That's in March 16th, so about, I think, 3 weeks from now. After John Hoberman comes, we'll have Cheryl Cookie. She'll be giving the talk, Gender and Ethical Challenges in Sport and Media. She's an associate professor of American Studies at Purdue University, and actually a good buddy of mine from graduate school. Let's see, her research centers on the way that gender shapes experience, cultural meanings, and societal structures in sport. Her work offers ways of understanding voices of freedom and responsibility, voices of authority and power, voices of prejudice and ignorance, voices of hope and possibility, and even voices of silence. There's a lot of voices going on there. So, I'll also say that Cheryl is the past president of the North American Society for the Sociology of Sport. Before I get to introducing tonight's speaker, I also want to introduce Jessica Kirby, who's the assistant director of the Center for the Critical Study of Sport. She'll be helping Jay out with the technical aspects of the talk, particularly the online polling. Just to tell you a little bit more about Jessica, she's a senior instructor for health sciences. She's a doctoral student at the University of Northern Colorado. She's a UCCS alumna. She's a Colorado native. She's a mother of two. And tonight she's our technical whiz, just in case she didn't do enough already. So our speaker tonight is Jay Coakley. Jay is one of the most humble and down-to-earth people you'll ever meet. If you ever have the pleasure of having a meal with him or just having a conversation with him, you would never know that he is one of the world's leading sports sociologists. In fact, he's probably the most formative person of our field. Just to give you a sense of his impact. You take a look at his book, Sport and Society, Issues and Controversies. It's now in its 12th edition. It's been adopted for readers in Canada, the United Kingdom and Europe, Australia and New Zealand and South Africa, and it's been translated into different languages. Like, how many languages? Is it 4? Yeah, 4 different languages that book has been translated into. So not only is Jay a world-class scholar, he's an emeritus professor of sociology here at UCCS. And I think you'll see in tonight's talk the core mission of Jay's scholarship. For those of us who have been active competitive athletes, we all know the story. We've been told that people should participate in sports because it's healthy. People should participate in sports because it builds character, right? It's a moralizing institution. But how many of us have competed when we were injured, and injuries from our sport competition? How many of us have cheated or done other unscrupulous actions to better our chances of winning? So, who's going to cast the first stone? Jay's core mission is to make sport more democratic, more inclusive, and more safe. His mission is to make sport live up to its promise and its potential. So we're extremely lucky tonight to welcome Jay Coakley.
Hey, thanks, Jeff, and thanks to the center. Whoops. And thanks to the Daniels Fund Ethics Initiative for sponsoring tonight's program. And welcome to all of you. Thanks for coming. And for those people who are tuning in and watching the live stream of this, welcome to you as well. So over the past 40 years or so, I've been observing, studying, writing about youth sports to achieve the goals that Jeff just mentioned, make them more accessible to young people throughout the United States and actually in a number of other countries as well. And also make them more democratic and humane. And by democratic, I mean that basically we want the voices of sport participants to have more of an impact on the structure and organization of sport. And basically, I am interested in the ethical context of sport and youth sport in particular. And basically, what we're going to do tonight is discuss ethics and youth sport coaches. And why are we doing that tonight? Well, for one reason, youth sports are unregulated in the United States. They are a fragmented, incohesive collection of programs that are organized around the interests of the adults who run them. And that's a little bit of a problem. We don't have any kind of a centralized authority in the United States. We're the only country, major post-industrial country, not to have a ministry of sport that provides guidelines for people who are working in youth sports. The perceived stakes for success in youth sports today is tremendously high for the young athletes, for their families, and for coaches. So people have higher expectations now than they've ever had before. And there's little coaching education in the United States. And that does exist. There's some good programs, but a lot of the programs that exist are driven by liability issues rather than real concern over the development and growth and well-being of young people. And the dropout, injury, and burnout rates have increased tremendously over the last decade, and they're at alarmingly high rates. And that is related to the way youth sports are organized. Coaches are perceived to be significant role models. According to survey data, more than priests, more than ministers, more than teachers, more than any relative in a family except for maybe one of the parents. So coaches are significant others in the socialization experiences of young people. And that means that youth sports becomes an ethics incubator for young people. They look to coaches for cues on how to make decisions when it comes to the challenges that they face, decision-making points in their youth sport experiences. So this makes coaches ethics educators by default. And coaches have very few have ever received any kind of training on how to be ethical while making decisions in connection with their coaching. So I'm not going to talk any more about this, but what we're going to do tonight is an exercise in applied ethics. And all of you have either seen or will see 12 scenarios that each of you are going to read and choose one of 3 responses related to each of those scenarios. And we're going to have those responses flashed up on the screen as you text them in. And to tell you how that's going to happen, I'm going to turn it over to Jessica Kirby, who will let you know how to do that.
All right, ready for some excitement? Okay, so all the information will be on the screen as well as your handout. So for each ethical scenario that we present, you will text in the answer of what you would do in the scenario. So we'll have live interactive way of kicking off each discussion of each scenario. So at the top of your handout, as well as at the top of middle of the screen, is the phone number that you text to. So we're gonna all do this test question right now so you can get the hang of it, and then we can get into the good stuff. So the number you're texting to, 650-600-9016, and that's at the top of each page of your handout as well. And then you see the bolded numbers, that is the message you send. That is the text of the message you send. So instead of sending a text message that says, hey, how's it going? You choose one of those bolded numbers as your answer, and you send that in. So give it a try. Hopefully it will be very easy to do. Yeah, just a test, no pressure. There's no right or wrong answer on this question.
Everybody passes.
Anyone having trouble? Does it give you any type of confirmation? No? Okay. Well,
You can only vote once.
yeah, you can only vote once for each question. So think about your answer carefully when we get to the better questions. Does everyone feel comfortable with this process? Any questions? This is just a test question. So it's just ABC, so the numbers appear, and this test question's at the very bottom last.
Yeah, the last page. It's after the 12th scenario.
Any last questions? So we're going to do this for each of the 12 scenarios. So if you stumble in the first couple, you have 12 to practice. But it should be great to get a gauge of where the audience sits for each scenario, okay?
So are we ready to jump into the first scenario? I know that you can see it and read it. I'm actually going to read it out loud, I think, so that everybody has access to the same information at the same time. So Bill coaches a team of 11-year-old boys in a tackle football league. Nearly all of his players attend the same elementary school, and just prior to the last game of the season, Coach Bill learns that Darren, his starting quarterback and best player, has been suspended from school for bullying a fifth-grade girl with a disability. If Darren does not play in this game, the team's chances of making it to the playoffs is slim. So, there's three responses. A, the coach should not allow Darren to play. B, the coach should ignore the situation at school and allow Darren to play. C, the coach should talk with Darren's parents and the school counselor to determine what to do. So the text numbers are next to each of those responses. So if you could text in the choice that you make for that particular scenario, we'll see it on the screen.
And I should have mentioned for anyone watching on the live stream, you should have the Google Doc attachment with the numbers to reference as well, so you can text in as well from home.
Now, our goal here is to take a look at the responses and then to check back with you and see what kind of a guideline you were using to make your choice, what kind of a principle your choice is based on. And if somebody can take some notes as we go along, at the end, maybe we can come up with a list of guidelines to help coaches work through ethical situations or ethical challenges. All right, so what we have here is that, okay. Yeah, I don't know how fast people who are watching this in remote locations will be able to text in, but we're going to have to move along because I want to get through as many of these scenarios as possible. So it seems that B, the coach should ignore the situation at school and allow Darren to play, is the least popular choice. It's the boys will be boys choice. And by the way, it's the choice that's being made at the high school, college, and professional level most often, all right? For this group, at the youth sport level, it's the least popular choice. The coach should not allow Darren to play is kind of surprisingly the most popular choice by just over half of everybody texting in. But a close second is that the coach should talk with Darren's parents and the school counselor to determine what to do. And I guess for those of you who chose A, what kind of a principle did you use to make that choice? Yes.
Well, going back to what you were saying at the beginning, that the coaches are such a significant role model to the boy, and the fact that if it was the coach himself telling the player, you cannot play in this game because of these actions, this player is going to see that not only was it for his actions wrong, but also that his coach himself doesn't approve of those actions, and not just his parents and his counselors saying that was wrong, you can't play.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a good point because the coach's decision reverberates through the entire team, and actually in this case through the entire league possibly. So the message comes through loud and clear to all of these formidable young people who are learning about how to apply ethical principles in their lives. So the other issue, well, are there other principles or guidelines that motivated your response, whether it was A or C? Any others? Yes.
We don't know for sure whether he actually did it. That was the question in my mind. So he's suspended from school, but we don't know what kind of process is involved.
Okay. Yeah.
One of my sons was expelled from school on the day when he was accused of lighting a fire at school and hitting a teacher in the face with a snowball. And he was in the hospital recovering from surgery that day.
Yeah. So obviously there could be a problem, but well, in this scenario, we're assuming that the bullying did occur, that there was due process at the school that led to the suspension. So for the coach to know that is an issue. So that would have to be in the back of the coach's mind. But if he had some confidence in the school, then A would be a reasonable choice. So C would be another possibility. And I can see that all of you were mixed. The other point that could be made here is that a lot of people say that sport is separate from the rest of society. But that's obviously not the case. And when a professional football player says something about politics now, everybody says, shut up, don't talk about politics, that's not what you're all about. But to separate sport from the rest of society puts it in kind of an ethical vacuum. So there is a sports society connection. And oftentimes there's not enough reciprocity between other institutional spheres and sport. And I don't want to get hung up on this, but oftentimes as a faculty member, I'd get a note from the athletic department or a coach saying, please excuse all of our athletes on this particular day because they're at an away game. Well, if I send a note to the athletic department saying, please excuse all of your athletes from practice because we have a big test coming up, the coach would look at us like we were crazy. It's sport gets, but it doesn't give. So what you're saying here, for over 50% of you, is that there is a connection, okay? And the guideline is that actions have consequences, and that coaches need to use opportunities to make boys in particular much more sensitive because basically we've assumed that boys are naturally insensitive, and that's been a problem. So, okay, let's jump to the next scenario.
One short thing to add.
Sure.
In this scenario, I teach a methods of coaching class, and my students said, but what about the rest of the team that's being punished because you're making a decision to take our star away? This comes from parents, not necessarily the kids themselves, but the parents. So how do you handle that situation?
Yeah, my response would be, these are 11-year-olds. What is the goal of our youth sport program? All right? And given the fact that we're dealing with 11-year-olds, you know, if we're dealing with players with you know, $50,000 on the line or a scholarship on the line, you know, then maybe we could talk in some different terms. But this gives another player a chance to play quarterback. So, okay. Okay, so scenario 2, which is an interesting one that I thought was going to become more common when disability rights were being emphasized in the past. I don't know how they're going to be emphasized in the future in our schools, but and in our sport programs. But Coach Gibson is working with a group of 9-year-old girls in a community-based recreational soccer league. One of the girls trying out for the team has a weak left leg, a disabled left arm, and no left side peripheral vision due to cerebral palsy caused by a stroke in utero. This is my granddaughter. She wears a brace on her left foot and lower leg and runs slower than most other girls and has a difficult time seeing and passing to her left. So, should Coach Gibson should support the girl and explain her condition to referees and opposing coaches. Coach Gibson should refer the girl to a local recreation program for children with disabilities. Or C, Coach Gibson should let her play in team practices but not in games for her own safety. So make your choice. Whoa. Okay. We're starting to see a pattern emerge here, and the majority of people, over close to 60%, chose A. Coach Gibson should support the girl and explain her condition to referees and opposing coaches. My granddaughter is 18 now, but when she was 9 playing soccer, not one coach in any of her experiences chose A. All right? You are making the choice. And what's the principle or the guideline underlying your choice? Talk a little louder.
She should explain her condition to the referees and opposing coaches. And I guess I coach hockey, and I have an athlete who can't see on his left eye and is struggling with his left hand. It's competitive.
Right.
And it's not he's capable of handling it, or things he has to deal with. And my dilemma would be, he's harder I would let her play, but I'm not sure necessarily telling the other team. To me, that's a
Right.
dilemma of, are the kids going to be playing back? Is then the coach going to feel responsible if something happens because he let us play?
Right.
I don't like anybody.
Yeah. And that's a good, yeah. So the point is that you're exposing this young person's disability to the other team and the referees, and under certain circumstances, that might not be the wisest thing to do. And the issue here, though, is ability, physical ability varies among human beings. And when do we have opportunities to learn how to accommodate ability differences in our interaction and in our physical activities? You know, we don't get training in that. we enter sports settings where the focus is on the best, the winners, having better skills than other people, but there are few opportunities for kids to learn how to adjust game models and rules in order to be inclusive. And if we're talking about 9-year-olds, that's a good time to learn. If we're talking about 16-year-olds on a high school varsity team, that's a different story. Okay, so this is a teachable moment, but you have to be careful, as was pointed out, that you're not doing something that girl doesn't want done, or that girl's parents don't want done. So, if you make it possible for that young person to stay in sport, that's going to have an impact on the rest of their lives. And if you make it possible for other people to learn about ability differences and how to make adjustments, then that's going to affect the rest of their lives. So, and by the way, ability exists on a continuum, and there's a lot of different dimensions of ability. So that 9-year-old, my granddaughter, could run 5Ks faster than 95% of the players that she was playing with on the soccer team. She can tie her shoes with one hand. She can button her shirts with one hand. She can zip her clothes with one hand. So, if we lived in a shoe tying sports setting, all of us would be disabled. She'd be the star of the show. So, we have to learn about how to accommodate ability differences regardless of our situations. So, plus, let me just read you from the Americans with Disabilities Act. People with disabilities must be allowed to participate in programs open to everyone as long as they and the accommodations they require do not threaten the health and safety of other players, cause undue burden for the sponsoring organization, or fundamentally change the sport being played. Threats to health and safety must be real, based on objective information, and unavoidable even after reasonable efforts have been made to eliminate them. It's the law. And it's been the law for over 20 years. So, that would fit with certain kinds of conditions attached to it. So, okay. So let's, yes. Yeah, only if there was a threat to health and safety. And for example, if her peripheral vision was causing her to have contact that wouldn't normally occur, and by the way, that's what happened. Because she couldn't see, she thought people were knocking her down when it was as much her fault as her opponent's fault. And what I wanted the coach to say to the opposing players was, you're going to knock her down every now and then because she can't see to her left, and that's okay. Just help her up. And, because then she won't think that people are out to get her. So that's a simple accommodation to make. So, if there was a danger, then that would be a problem, okay? If there was a real danger to health and safety, all right? So, and those are calls. We're dealing with borderline calls here on every one of these scenarios, okay? So number 3, a rule infraction unseen by a referee. This is a tough one. Coach Phillips has the highest rated 12-year-old football team in a Dallas, Texas competitive league. They're down 5 points with seconds to play. His halfback returns a punt down the sidelines for a 50-yard touchdown. The teenage referees did not see the halfback step out of bounds in front of Coach Phillips and his team bench, but the coach and the team members see it clearly. Time runs out, and the players and their parents rush the field to celebrate. So, A, Coach Phillips should report the infraction to the referee and have the game outcome reversed, because time's out. B, Coach Phillips should let the play stand and tell his players that referees make mistakes, that that referee mistakes are part of the sport. C, Coach Phillips should ignore the call and allow his players to enjoy their win. Well, we can have a good discussion on this one.
It's a race, it's back and forth.
Okay, it looks like ignoring the whole situation is out for the vast majority of people. And although I'd like to hear from the people who did select C and see what the principle or the guideline would be, okay, if you want to volunteer that information. So what about the principle or guideline related to A or B? Anybody want to jump in? So for B, okay. Yeah, so that's why I put teen referee in there, because one of the biggest problems in youth sports right now is getting referees, because they don't want to put up with the hassles that they're experiencing from coaches and parents. So some leagues are saying now, we have to, as coaches and as league people, we have to help referees learn and assist them in connection with the games. So, so that maybe influenced some of you who chose A. So anybody choose A? What's the principle or guideline that you would have there? Mm-hmm.
To me, it's a teachable moment to say, do what's easy or what's right. I mean, they clearly saw that that was not fair play. I mean, your player was out of bounds. So to me, it's a huge teachable moment to say, what's more important? Valuing the true nature of sport, which is, play by the rules and all, or do you just, let something go like that?
Yeah. Yeah, one of the issues here is that as young people are introduced to sport through adult-controlled, organized programs, what happens is that they never learn that to play a game, you need to cooperate. And you need to agree on what the rules are, and you need to enforce those rules yourself. That's what kids used to learn in informal games. And now, kids see the rules as something to get around, and the referees, you play to the level of the ref, and so learning to make ethical decisions within an organized sport context is very different than learning in an informal game context. So what do we want 12-year-olds to learn in this particular situation would be the question. And fairness requires cooperation. And cooperation is related to the rules of the game and how they're to be enforced. Now, referees do make mistakes. That is part of the game when you get to be in the NFL or in college sports or high school sports. But at a 12-year-old level, I think we can debate that particular issue in terms of referees making mistakes. These are teenage referees. So yes, Peggy.
Jay, I would have to agree with Alicia. I think we talked about the pillars of characters. What's the definition of sportsmanship and trustworthiness? And, these young kids need to learn at a very young age. Yes, of
Yeah, I'd like to see games played every now and then without referees and have the children call their own plays, call their own fouls. And by the way, they do that in Ultimate. You know, Ultimate Frisbee, the spirit of the game. They make all their own calls. There are no referees. And it's a unique event to watch. So adults do this. Do we want children to learn how to do it is, I guess, the issue. And at what point are we going to say the referee's decision stands and they make mistakes, which obviously occurs. So we don't have instant replays in youth sports, though. Yeah, we could have a good debate on this if we had more time, but I can see why that most of you are split on this particular one. Okay. So let's go to scenarios 4, 5, and 6, and I'm going to cover those all three together because they all deal with a similar issue, and these are very important issues. So we'll do our responses to each. We'll go through each of them, and then we'll go back to 4, okay? So number 4, in her first paid coaching job at a nationally known youth soccer club, Sarah, a 22-year-old coach, regularly sees serious bruises on her star player's body. The player says that she got them while playing soccer with her older brothers and their friends, but Sarah has seen the player's father grab her by the neck, yell at her, and shove her roughly into the car after a couple of their games. The coach suspects that the girl is being abused at home. A, Sarah should talk to the player regularly during practices and ask if she really gets the bruises as she says. B, Sarah should confront the father in private and let him know about the bruises. C, Sarah should call local law enforcement or human services to make a report. So select one of those. Okay. So it looks like there's a definite pattern here. So this scenario, by the way, was given to me by my daughter, who's a 25-year child protection worker in the Department of Human Services in Fort Collins. Really happened. Okay. So let's go to scenario 5 now. Coach Dobbs is the volunteer head coach of a preteen track team, 10 to 12-year-old children in a highly successful regional club. Her team practices in the same stadium at the same time as Coach Smith's nationally successful under-18 track team. Over the course of the season, Coach Dobbs sees Coach Smith use obscene and abusive language with his athletes, kick their duffel bags, and throw fits of anger when they don't meet his expectations. A, Coach Dobbs should report what she has seen to the director of the track club. B, Coach Dobbs should ignore the situation because it's not her team. C, Coach Dobbs should meet with Coach Smith to tell him that his players are intimidated and fearful. Okay. So the pattern seems to be pretty clear here. People are not picking B, ignoring the situation. So it's either talking with the fellow coach or reporting what she has seen to the director, which is the predominant response. Okay, so let's go to scenario 6. By the way, this scenario 5 is right out of the news at CSU. All right, Larry Eustace, the men's basketball coach, did that and worse. So I won't go into the details, but they reported it in the Coloradoan, and when they reported it, the Coloradoan journalists got so much flack about exposing the locker room. They cut their subscriptions, they wanted the journalists fired, and they called them all sorts of nasty things. But anyway, scenario 6. Coach Clark is the new assistant gymnastics coach at a gym that has produced age group champions. Over the course of several months, he has noticed several situations in which the head coach and gym owner has touched 10 to 12-year-old female gymnasts in a clearly inappropriate way. He reports what he has seen to USA Gymnastics. So the choices here. A, USA Gymnastics should do a discreet investigation of this coach. B, USA Gymnastics should file a report with the local law enforcement or human services. C, USA Gymnastics should wait until a gymnast or a gymnast's parents report a specific case of abuse. Okay. So looks like A and B. If you chose A, that's what USA Gymnastics did with this particular case that's headlines in the Gazette today and has been headlines in Indianapolis and USA Today for a number of days, if not weeks now. So, and there are over 60 women who have given testimony about digital penetration of their vaginas and anus by Larry Nasser, the team physician for USA Gymnastics, who was highly respected and looked up to as a god by these young women. He did this without a glove, without any lubricant, and without any chaperone there. So USA Gymnastics waited a while. They hired somebody to do an investigation after they decided that maybe that wasn't quite the right thing to do. They reported it to the FBI, wrong reporting chain. The FBI waited months to investigate this particular case. And according to the lawyers who are investigating this case, there are hundreds of young women involved. So, so this is a real life situation. And now let's go to the next slide because I want to take care of this because there's pretty much consensus on this. I want to take care of this by saying that there are laws that apply here. And the reporting is demanded of certain professionals who are required by law to report suspected child abuse and neglect. It's a Class 3 misdemeanor in Colorado for a mandated reporter to fail to report suspected child abuse or neglect or knowingly make a false report and is punishable under law. Okay, and the next slide. So, what is a mandatory reporter required to do? In fact, go to the next slide, Jess. Here are the selected categories of professions. You can go to the Colorado Children's Code and look this up. There's a whole page of the professions who are mandated to report. And the mandated reporters, the selected ones that I've listed there, you can take a look at. And the ones that I've highlighted are a public or private school official or employee, any coach who's paid at a public or private school, any director, coach, assistant coach, or athletic program personnel employed by a private sports organization or program. And employed here means an individual who is compensated beyond reimbursement for expenses related to the private sports organization or program. All right? And go back to the last one, Jess. Thanks. So what's a mandatory reporter required to do? Any person on that list has, if that person has reasonable cause to know or suspect that a child has been subjected to abuse or neglect, or observe the child being subjected to circumstances or conditions that would reasonably result in abuse or neglect, the mandatory reporter shall immediately upon receiving such information report or cause a report to be made of such fact to the county department, the local law enforcement agency, or through the child abuse reporting hotline system. You don't report it to the director. You don't report it to somebody else and wait for them to do something. You call right then to local law enforcement or the Department of Human Services in your area, period. That is the law, and it's a misdemeanor for you not to do that. And you will be tried. So, if we go back to the first abuse case, reporting case, scenario 4, and look at the responses there. So is it that one? Yeah, okay. So Sarah should talk to the player. What was the principle there? Anybody? I mean, that's not the legal response, but what would be a justification for that? So, according to my daughter, that's one of the worst things you can do, all right? Because once you talk to the player who's being abused by, if the player is being abused by the father, they're going to use you and what you have said and the questions you've asked to confront the father. And then you're going to have a man who's very, very upset, and you better watch it when you're walking to your car, all right? And if you're not in danger, that young girl is going to be in much more danger now that she has disclosed this to the coach. So you have put her in serious jeopardy if you talk with her, because you don't know exactly what she's going to do with your conversation. And confronting the father would put everybody in jeopardy, all right, if there's abuse going on, okay? So the legal thing to do, and the reason it's legal here, is that she's got a paid coaching position. That's the key part of that scenario. If she was a volunteer coach, she wouldn't be bound by the law in the same way as a paid coach, all right? So, and this is a major issue. The USOC has developed Safe Sport. They started in 2010. Finally, in 2017, 7 years later, they finally got an office going, or will have one going in Denver that's autonomous, separate from the USOC, because there is so much of abuse-related issues in youth sports. Okay. So, and I don't want to cause a moral panic here, but we're dealing with vulnerable young people who are subject to abuse by people who they know, by relatives, or by other coaches. So which is the reporting possible abuse B. So if we go to the outcomes for B, this is the volunteer coach. Coach Dobbs should report what she has seen to the director of the track team. Because she's a volunteer, she doesn't fall under the law. So reporting it to the director would be an appropriate thing. I didn't put in there reporting it to local law enforcement or human services, but that would be another alternative for her. She's just not mandated to do it, all right? So, and a lot of coaches think that certain forms of abuse, they don't call it abuse, they call it toughening their players up. And so they feel that using obscenities, demeaning them, is somehow developmental. And it's not developmental for NFL or NBA players, and it's certainly not developmental for 10 to 12-year-olds. So although the CSU coach who used the F word all the time, every other sentence, called his players effin', C blank blank TS, threw cans of soda against the board, had it explode all over, kicked things all over locker rooms, threw chairs on the floor, grabbed players' faces and forced them to look at him in the eye while he demeaned and read them the riot act. They did this investigation. The athletic director said he should be fired. The president of the university said, well, that would be a whole hassle, bad public relations, legal expenses. So let's keep him on. We'll slap him on the wrist, put him in a little professional development, and give him a $200,000 raise that year, which is more than the raises that I got through my entire career, 40 years of teaching. But, and by the way, if a teacher did any of this, we'd be gone. No questions asked, no committee constituted, we'd be gone. This is the highest paid teacher at CSU. Second highest, the football coach is the highest. But, so these are children that we're talking about here, and the report has to be made to the report should be made to the director of the track club, if not going to law enforcement. So scenario 6, this is one, like I say, right out of the headlines. Larry Nasser is now being charged. He's in jail in Michigan, and a class action suit is being filed against USA Gymnastics and against the Carolis, who ran the ranch on which possibly hundreds of girls were abused. So, basically, we're dealing with a clear violation of law, and USA Gymnastics should have called law enforcement right away, local law enforcement, and or human services. The FBI is too detached from what's going on. So, any comments on that? So these are, because the law applies here, state law, federal law, NGB, National Governing Body rules. You know, every NGB now has rules spelled out on issues related to abuse. I think every NGB, they should. Most do.
I'm just wondering, taking sides, I think everything of those coaches in that range, do you think maybe going to the FBI got this thing blown up to a point where somebody's taken care of, where it would have been a local law enforcement thing, that there could be pressure from somewhere else that maybe this swept under longer? You know, that seems like a jump to go to the FBI.
Yeah. Well, if they had called local law enforcement or Department of Human Services, they would have been there within 2 hours, not 7 months. Okay, so, and they would have done an investigation that if they found out that there were problems across state lines, they would have pulled the FBI in. And, you know, they're trained for 8 weeks before they take their job in child protection on all of these kinds of issues. So I'm pretty confident in most local programs and also local law enforcement. They know what the story is as well.
The sick thing about the USOC making that mistake, though, a benefit of it was initially it was only 1 to 5 girls in the first report. And by the end, now it's a lot. So because it was swept under the rug, the girls started talking. Whereas if it had been put out initially, having been law enforcement before, some girls would be like, don't see nothing, and then nobody would speak.
Oh, definitely.
So I'm not saying that that was a positive, but in a way, now they have a stronger case against this gentleman by the Olympic Committee making that kind of mistake.
Yeah, if you saw the young girls, the young women on 60 Minutes last Sunday, the 3 young women talking about this, in retrospect, they are all in their early 20s now, and they were talking about their time when they were 12, 13, 14 years old, and being abused in this way, because a lot of gymnasts have hip problems. And so he was saying, oh, you got a hip problem. Well, that requires me to go internally and massage and do this and that in order to get your hip back in place. Now, these girls, their families have mortgaged their house, put second mortgages on their house to keep them in these programs in some cases. They've spent up to $40,000, $50,000, $60,000 a year on their kids' gymnastics. This child from age 5 years old till now has had one focus in her life, and that is making an Olympic team, and she is on the verge. And this is the doctor who's going to make it all possible. Now, you tell me how many of those girls are going to report or be suspicious about things, even if they think something's wrong. Well, hundreds, and they don't report. Until a couple people did, and now they're coming out of the woodwork. So these young kids are really vulnerable to these authority figures. And they're very unlikely to raise questions. Okay. All right. So let's go to the next scenario. I feel like we should spend more time on those, but this one is Coach Richards is an assistant coach of a junior high basketball team. The team is especially talented this year, and the head coach decides to hold practice sessions during the week between Christmas and January 2nd, even though the league rules prohibit practices during this dead period. The players, including your son, want to practice, and other coaches and administrators are not around to see the team. So, Coach Richards, A, should report this rule infraction to the school's athletic director and principal. B, Coach Richards should ignore the infraction because the team wants to practice. C, Coach Richards should send an anonymous letter to team parents letting them know of the infraction. What to do? So it looks like consensus is emerging here with almost 90% of people responding A. And so what's the guideline or the principle here that leads you to choose A? It's a rule. Okay, that's pretty straightforward. Okay. Can you think of any ways around, are there any possible other responses? I only use 3, but is there a fourth response that maybe you'd like to see in there? Talk to the coach? Yeah, that would be a possibility. But if you're an assistant coach and you don't have much power and, the head coach is the one who okays your next contract, that could be tricky, okay? One of the other possible responses would be the coach says to one of the people at the school, I'd like to have an open gym here, and make explicit to the players, this is not mandatory, but if you want to come and have pickup games or shoot around, and sweep the gym afterwards and do that, be responsible, maybe that would be an alternative. But too often, sports interferes with family life. And if I don't know about your family life, but between Christmas and New Year's and in the family that I'm a part of, that's when we make our plans. And if some coach says, you've got to go to practice during that week, we're going to be really upset. And if that child doesn't go to practice and gets benched, then we're really going to be upset. So, I didn't put parents in this one, but, parents have made plans, man. You can't call practice when that's a dead period. So it's a rule. And people have acted on the basis of that rule. So that's a pretty clear guideline. So scenario 9, I wanted to get to this one for sure. You are the coach of a community-based junior rugby team. During a game, one of your players is tackled and his head hits the ground hard. He gets up slowly and wanders around for a few seconds before returning to his position. You're familiar with research on traumatic brain injuries among young people in contact sports, so you take him out of the game. Your league doesn't have a concussion protocol, and the player's parents object to your decision and want him back in the game. A, you stick to your decision and ask the parents to keep an eye on their son for the next week during which he cannot practice with the team. B, you return the player to the game because his parents are ultimately responsible for his safety. C, you keep the player out of the game but allow him to practice so you can keep an eye on him. Right. That was so easy that I didn't put it in there. So we want to have some distribution here, but we don't get much. This is a tough one. I mean, put yourself in that particular situation. You know, we're all sitting in this room apart from real life in this sense, and it's easy for us to make this decision. But when you're on a sideline during a game and the parents are there and they're saying he's okay, he can play, and he says, I'm okay, I can play, that's tough. That is tough. And I can tell you that in the past, over 90% of all coaches would have put that player back in. And that still happens in some settings at elite levels, although we're coming around to understanding the impact of not just concussions. We use the word concussion all the time, but it's repetitive subconcussive head hits that are probably the most dangerous things. The things that soccer players do hundreds of times during a soccer season with their headers. The things that football players do hundreds and hundreds of times during every season as they get hit on the head. And by the way, helmets do nothing. What happens with a concussion or a brain trauma is when your brain hits the inside of your skull because of a sudden stop or because of a sudden jerk, rotational force. Helmets do nothing to stop a brain from hitting the inside of your skull. All right? It prevents skull fracture and your brain spilling out on the field. But it doesn't prevent brain injury. And a child's brain is much more susceptible to injury, a developing brain is much more susceptible to injury than a fully developed brain. And one of the reasons for that is that tau proteins exist in the brain to stabilize the cellular structure of neurons, all right, tau proteins. But when your brain hits the inside of the skull, what happens is that tau proteins think that there's instability in neuronal activity. So they gear up, reproduce, get to that spot. And because they feel that there's a need for them. And depending on where and how much this occurs, there can be temporary or permanent disruption of neurological function because the tau proteins form plaques that keep neurons from communicating with each other. That's what dementia is all about. That's what chronic traumatic encephalopathy, CTE, which cost the NFL $1 billion so far. My prediction is it'll go up to $3 billion before it's over, because a number, I'm not going to say the majority, a number of former football players who started especially when they were kids. If you play from age 6 through high school, you're in trouble, possibly, because of this. That's why there's such a big issue now related to football and its safety. And a child's brain is not like your ACL. You know, you can limp around with a bad ACL. You can put up with that ACL pain. But when you have the onset of CTE, what happens is that you have memory loss, low impulse control, erratic behavior, impaired judgment, depression, aggression, balance problems, and gradual onset of dementia. Okay, that's serious stuff. That's not an ACL or a meniscus or an MCL or Tommy John surgery or a shoulder replacement. So that's your brain. So there was an issue or question. Did you have
Yeah,
a?
I was going to say, I think that the NFL is actually helping change this for these sport coaches.
Mhm.
A lot of people watch football on Sundays and see star players get held out.
Mhm.
That I think it's easier for a coach to make this decision than probably 5 years ago.
You're right. It's easier for a coach to make this decision now than it was 5 years ago, certainly. We didn't even know any of this stuff 5 years ago in popular culture. I mean, there's a few medical people who knew about it. Okay, yes.
I just want to mention, there's laws in place right now for any of the youth. I'll speak to soccer because that's what I'm a part of. If a child suffers any type of a head injury, the referees are asked and they go through training. And any coach above U11 also has to go through that training.
Right.
It's a state law here in Colorado.
Right.
And many of the other states have adopted it. I don't know that they've done everything that they can for concussion protocol, but U.S. Soccer has
Right.
started a great deal of it, so
Yeah.
there are a lot
And they're even eliminating headers for kids under a certain age, yes.
I coach youth lacrosse and we're trained for that. But one of the things that's really interesting about this topic, like my huge pet peeve, is we still celebrate by hitting people on heads. But we turn on and like that's another interesting question. I go to coaches meetings and I'll say, please tell your players not to pat or don't hit your players on the head.
Yeah.
We're coaching coaches that this is really bad, and then as soon as the player scores a goal, they're head button and we're hitting kids on the head. It's like anything to the head is bad. So it's
Right.
interesting. We
Yeah.
see it in games, but we don't necessarily see it in other places.
Yeah. If I told you right now, I want your son or daughter to go to that wall and hit their head on it 1,500 times and do that every year for the next 5 years, which is what happens in soccer and in football, you'd call me crazy. Meanwhile, it's been happening, and parents have been paying for it. So there's need for more awareness here. Okay, scenario 10.
Do you want to skip to the specialization one since we're about at 7?
Okay.
Do you want to skip to 11?
Yeah, let's skip to 11. Specialization. Eric Pike is the founder and manager of a well-known private competitive volleyball club. To make year-round living for himself and his highly qualified coaches, he demands that the 11 to 15-year-old players participate only in club soccer for the 50 weeks a year in which he runs competitions and camps. Parents pay at least $4,000 per year in club dues and camp fees. He knows that sports science research clearly shows that athletes in such a program have higher overuse injury and burnout rates than occur among multi-sport participants, and that specialized club players don't have an advantage in being recruited for college scholarships when compared to multi-sport athletes. So what should Eric do? Eric should continue marketing his program as the best alternative for young volleyball players. B, Eric should reduce competition and camp schedules so that young people can play other sports each year. C, Eric should demand that his coaches spend 50% of practice time playing other sports and informal games during practice itself. Okay. And I don't want to influence your answers here, but Eric's family depends on year-round participation. And his coaches and their families all depend on year-round participation. This is their livelihood. Okay, so that puts a little reality into the situation. And that has started since the 1980s when tax monies were taken away from park and recreation. The public programs, private programs emerged, youth sport entrepreneurs entered the fray, and they had to have 12-month-a-year programs or else they couldn't live. So they created this myth that specialize in one sport year-round is the way to go. And they used the old Soviet Union and East Germany to back up their case. And by the way, I was in the Soviet Union and East Germany during those years, and they didn't do it that way. Okay, they did a lot of cross-training, and their athletes, even in particular sports, were multi-sport athletes. But and they took drugs too. But so they won a lot of medals. But for B, what's your logic there? What are the guidelines? Yes.
Comment, maybe you would consider on the scenario is what coaches promise the kids and the parents if they do participate year-round, that they're almost guaranteed a D1 scholarship.
Yeah.
And this is the only way that they will get probably a scholarship to college, and that's such a myth.
Yeah.
And the parents, they bite at it.
Yeah. They don't know coaches when they're scouting. They give priority to multi-sport athletes almost all the time. And so this is part of the myth that has been perpetuated by the youth sport entrepreneurs whose livelihoods depend on this kind of participation. Another response here would be have those youth sport entrepreneurs get together with their peers and develop a 4-sport club. And you would have 4 seasons during the year. And you would have competitions in each of those sports for those 4 different sports, and you'd still have dues for the whole year. It's just that you'd exclude about 70% of the population that can't afford your club, okay, which is already happening. All right. So specialization is a myth in terms of developing skills. And 50% of all pediatric sport injuries are due to overuse and repetitive use. So the orthopedics people now who are doing Tommy John surgeries, 400% increase in the past 10 years in Tommy John surgeries on the elbow for pitchers who are throwing too many pitches and playing too many months during the course of the year. MCL and ACL surgeries among kids under the age of 12 have gone up hundreds of percent. Okay, so what happens when you play one sport is that your body doesn't develop a balanced musculature. And you make yourself susceptible, in addition to repetitive use injuries, you make yourself susceptible to other injuries as well. So when kids play a lot of informal games and multiple sports, they were much less likely to have injuries. And by the way, they were much more likely to participate through the life course. Kids who play specialized sports eventually get to a point where they don't play that sport anymore, but they've never had experience playing other sports, so they sit on a couch, and then we've got diabetes, and we've got obesity, and we've got one of the highest obesity rates in the world. So those are issues that we really need to address, because the vast majority of kids now are playing one sport year-round. They play 2 seasons, they play tournaments over holidays, and they play in summer camps or camps between seasons. So that is something that we really need to educate parents on as well as coaches. And there are alternatives for these coaches. Multi-sport clubs, duh. Okay, that seems to be reasonable. Okay, so we're out of time, and I really appreciate you hanging in there. We didn't talk about 10, which is a real live case, health and well-being of athletes, untaping the girls' legs. You know, I remember Kim Zemeskel back in 1991 saying, you know, if they did an X-ray of our bodies, they'd find that our bodies are riddled with stress fractures. She was a gymnast. And the X-rays do show that if you've been doing gymnastics for 5 years or so, hitting that vault and hitting the landing, that your bone structure in your wrist and hands starts to look like the bone structure of a 4-legged bear rather than a human being. It changes the bone structure. And gymnast's wrist is just a part of the game, hitting those vaults. And so Dominique Mociano, she had so many stress fractures in her what's this bone, the tibia? Yeah, that they thought that when she landed off of a vault that her legs would explode. Okay. And that's normal operating procedures in that particular sport. Okay. So these are some of the ethical things. I'm going to try to pull together some guidelines that we haven't had a chance to do and post them online through the Center for Critical Study of Sport, and that has a web page, but that would be one way that you can access that material. And I'll put all of these scenarios, I'm going to revise a couple of them. I'll put them all online. If you want to use them in your sport organizations, I have 10 other ones that I'm developing that I will add to them over time. And I've got a whole list of other ethical quandaries that coaches face. And we can put them there. You can use them in your coach training or in your meetings with coaches. I have no proprietary hold on any of this. This is for you to use to make sports more humane. All right. So take care. Thanks a lot for coming. And show your appreciation to Jessica for making all this happen. So thanks, Jessica.